It's Wednesday, December 11th, 2024, and welcome back to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a Hoover Institution podcast examining America's democratic process and the many challenges inherent in staging elections in these charged partisan times. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Hoover Institution's Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism. You might recognize me from the Matters of Policy and Politics podcasts that I do. You can find that and other excellent Hoover podcasts at hoover.org/podcast. I definitely recommend you check it out. Joining me today, he is the godfather, actually, of Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables. This was his idea back in 2022, so if you don't like it, blame him, but it's a great idea, and it's a great podcast, I think, because he is a great guest, a great guy all around, a great fellow, dare I say, my colleague Ben Ginsberg. Ben is the Hoover Institution's Volker Distinguished Visiting Fellow and a nationally known political law advocate who's involved in several projects this past year involving election integrity in this election cycle. He joins me today for this, the fourth and final installment of Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables for 2024 at least. We're going to talk about the end of the podcast, what the future holds for this and Ben's other endeavors in election integrity. Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here as always.
So to recap, my friend, in the first episode, it was you and me talking about the election from a 30,000-foot level, what we thought would happen. I need to go back and scrub out everything we got wrong, but I think actually we did pretty well in that podcast. It was okay. Yeah, can't get them all right. Second episode, you took the helm. You were the moderator. You did a really great job interviewing Justin Grimmer. For those who don't know Justin, he's a Hoover Senior Fellow and a Stanford University political scientist who studies election integrity. And he did something very cool this year. He actually traveled to Southern Oregon. He got out of the Stanford bubble and went and watched how the locals handle voting and how the voting system is challenged. Third episode, it was me and Ben again. We recorded about 32 hours after the polls had closed in Alaska. We talked about what worked and what didn't work in this election. I'm happy to report it was a surprisingly upbeat podcast with two guys I think who were seriously sleep deprived at the time. And now here we are, Ben, back again at it for our fourth and final episode. Let me read you something that Joe Biden said, Ben, 2 days after the election. I want to get your thoughts on this. Here's the president. He's still the president, by the way. Quote, I hope we can lay to rest the question about the integrity of the American electoral system. It is honest, it is fair, and it is transparent, and it can be trusted, win or lose. Pretty noble words from the president, I think, but also the kind of words you say when an election is decisive, no?
Yes, you certainly do. And this was a decisive election, right? All 7 battleground states moved in the same direction for Donald Trump by sufficient margins that there weren't recounts in any of them. Right. And Bill, it's amazing what that did for public confidence in the elections, where there was a great deal of doubt about it with surprisingly low confidence rates by the American people. After the election results, it has been historically high. There are polls out from Pew, Yankelovich, Morning Consult, an academic survey of performance of American elections, and all of them show that people believe the elections were run well and that the results were accurate. A tremendous transformation.
Let me phrase it to you this way, Ben. You spend a lot of time talking to election officials around the country. You've done some great conferences at Hoover, bringing these guys out to talk about what they go through. As you've talked about them since the election, Ben, do they feel like they're good or do they feel like they're lucky?
Lucky. I mean, let's be honest about this. The doubts about the election and the system were carried in over 100 lawsuits that have been filed, largely by Republican entities, but there were also a slew of Democratic entities challenging some parts of the election procedure. The results were so decisive that none of those suits have been carried on, and there was no sort of upset over the election results, which is why confidence went up. But nobody thinks that this is not what we'd call a cicada problem. It's going to go back underground and then reemerge at some point in the future. And so those doubts probably need to be addressed in the next few years.
I wish you had said cicada, Ben. I used to live in Washington, as you do, and I used to have a convertible, and I lived in Washington, and I would put the top down during cicada season, and literally the things would fly into your car and give you a heart attack every time they'd fly in the car.
They would. Well, we dressed up kids as cicadas when they were at a very tender young age, took lots of pictures. They loved it. They've really become family icons.
Yeah. I want to turn your attention, Ben, to a state you're more than familiar with, Pennsylvania. and something that happened as the vote count was going on in Pennsylvania. I think we could agree this would constitute what is genuine skullduggery. If you look at the numbers right now, Trump won Pennsylvania, Ben, by I think about 120,000 votes or so, about a 1.7% difference. So decisive. But as the votes were being counted, the election was still kind of being settled. You had a controversy in Pennsylvania. And here's what happened. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court had ruled before the election that mail ballots lacking formally required signatures or dates should not be included in official results. So what happens, lo and behold, a Democratic senator is trailing in his election, and Democratic officials in Philadelphia and Bucks County and Center County and Montgomery County, these are the suburbs of Philly, they ignore the court order. So, Ben, what happens when election officials go rogue?
Well, what happened in this instance is what should happen. The same thing that happened, for example, when election officials decided not to certify election results after 2022, the courts put them back in line. So if election officials go rogue, which is certainly what happened in this case, it took the courts to say, can't do that. And so the ballots that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said were not properly verified were not counted. And Bill, between what happened in Pennsylvania and what happened with certifications in 2022, but all elections were certified in 2024, the lawsuits that were brought before the election with a lot of banging of the drum and are not continued, it tells you that a lot of the rhetoric around elections, which has caused the decline in trust for elections, is really more about political tactics than deep-seated concerns and beliefs about the system.
If you're on a campaign, Ben, and let's put yourself in the situation. So Senator Casey, who was involved here in Pennsylvania, his campaign. If you're working on the Casey campaign, working on any campaign that's looking at this scenario, how do you legally prepare for a situation like this? Are you game planning this, war gaming this ahead of the election, or do you just kind of turn on the fly as the votes are being counted and realize that we need legal avenues here?
Even before Bush versus Gore, when I was a young puppy of a lawyer, we always prepared for recounts. And what that entailed, and still entails, is being sure that you have the law set, that you have personnel in all the polling places to be able to verify what's happening on election night. And yes, you do game plan out what you may do in a number of circumstances. The game planning is more a good mental exercise because you never, ever get it right, which you're going to be arguing. And recounts are situations where the position you take depends on whether you're winning or losing. If you're winning, you want to stop additional votes from coming in because you like the fact that you're winning. And if you're losing, the name of the game is to loosen requirements so that more votes come in, so you stand a better chance of gaining a lead.
Yeah. Now, I know there was a movie done on the Bush. Who played you in the movie, by the way? Bob Balaban?
I think it was George Clooney, wasn't it? Yeah, it might have been a short, bald, bearded guy instead.
Brad Pitt was
Balaban, wonderful character actor.
Yeah, Brad Pitt was busy, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but no, I mean,
Danny DeVito was too, blissfully.
People could go back and watch that movie and see, how, things went down in that, but you actually were there. So actually tell us how this worked out as an attorney in terms of that election night, and you see this incredibly ridiculously close vote in Florida, and just how the legal staff was kind of gearing up just really on the fly there.
And of course, what happened in Florida 2000 was really the mother of all recounts, that there would be a 537 vote margin in one state deciding a presidency is something that was probably not on many bingo cards going into that election. So as votes keep coming in and margins keep narrowing, you keep watching more and more for what could happen. And then at some point you make the decision, which was really the gut punch in the stomach decision, that you need to prepare for a recount. Right. So you send people into the state in all the relevant jurisdictions. You start pulling the law. You think very strongly how you have to staff it up. So the first decision the Bush campaign made, for example, was that James A. Baker III would run the effort. The ultimate combination of scholar, lawyer, uh, savvy political operative
Right.
was the perfect person to do that. And then you start building out an organization to handle the litigation that's going to come, the political operation of counting the ballots, the communications that you have to be able to explain what's going on to people. You need a ton of logistical folks to make everything happen. You need fundraising because recounts are unanticipated expenses when theoretically campaigns have spent all their money. So you do the organizational chart for how you're going to carry that out. But the real work, of course, is being sure that you have people to look over the ballots and to be present whenever ballots are counted.
And how do you work in terms of precedent, Ben? If you maybe I watch too many legal shows on TV, but there's always a lawyer who's going back into this room full of a million legal books, and he or she is always going back to precedent. So, as an elected attorney, how do you fall back on precedent, especially in a situation like Florida, which, in many regards, is unprecedented?
Well, recounts are always
Well, recounts are automatically triggered in most states by like what, a
well,
1%
only
difference?
in some states, but all the
Yeah.
precedents
Right.
that take place in a state are covered in state law. There might be an equal protection count in a recount case where not all similarly counted ballots are treated the same.
Hmm.
But by and large, the precedents that you look for first are what's happened in previous recounts in states. Often they are not statewide recounts, they're more localized. State legislative, maybe a statewide governor's race. And so you need to take the precedents and, like you do for any legal case, apply
Right.
it to the facts on the ground. The facts are generally developed by the lawyers talking to people who have been in the polling places on election day or are viewing the ballots as they're counted.
Hmm. Ben, do you pay much attention to what goes on in California in terms of the election and vote counting?
I do in the same sense that I watch NASCAR races for the Rex.
Okay, good analogy. Here's what I'd like to talk to you about. California has a mess on its hands. We can agree. One election official calls the California vote counting process a pig and a python. In other words, we have so many votes to count. We've created a system that makes it difficult to count that it's hard to digest it. And this is not a partisan observation. It's just a problem with common sense. And this year, Ben, state lawmakers came back to Sacramento. New session began on December the 2nd. Not the formal new legislature, but they came in a special second
Right.
session, December 2nd, the governor's request. You were still counting votes in California on December the 2nd. So this is confusion and this is bad. How did California get into this mess, Ben? And how does California get out of this mess?
Well, the way you get out of the mess is to pass more sensible laws.
Okay.
Look, so
We'll get to
there,
that in a minute, but let's explain how California, in terms, and explain to the audience just in terms of, how California's getting ballots and how they count the ballots.
well, they count the ballots late. California
Yes.
has moved to becoming an all-mail state, so
Right.
mail-in ballots. That means that people often drop off mail ballots on election day.
Right.
And then California's law says that any ballot postmarked on election day can be received up to 7 days afterwards. And
Right.
then there are additional time periods for ballot curing. In other words, if a signature doesn't match or a date is missing on an envelope, the
Right.
voter can be called to correct that.
Right.
Mail ballots generally require a lot more verification than if
Mhm.
somebody walks into the polls and casts a ballot.
Right.
Um, and so it is a combination of wanting to allow ballots to come in after a week after election day and to have maximum cure times. I guess the essential point is it's a balance, right? There is wanting to count as many votes as is physically possible, but
Right.
that does come at a cost for huge delays. And what we saw in 2020 is that delays between the polls closing and getting results is the petri dish for election conspiracy viruses to spread.
Right.
Just imagine if California was the outcome determinative presidential state and it was taking 3 weeks to figure out who won.
Right. And the problem in California, Ben, is it takes a long time. California was the last state to settle a House election. I believe it was about a week ago at this time it was
Yep.
settled. And the problem in California, at least, and again, I'm not being partisan here, is that these counts go on and they go on and they go on, and they invariably benefit the Democratic candidate. So this is, but again, it's a state that's 2-1 Democratic. So common sense would dictate if you have a lot of votes to count, there'll probably be more Democrats and Republicans voting.
It's kind of a condescending attitude by Democrats to provide all these opportunities. It sort of says there's something with our voters that they can't meet a deadline.
Well, I want to get to that. I want to get to that in a second. You're absolutely right. It is kind of like you're treating them like children. But the problem is you hit it on the head here. When you see a vote count that gets carried out for an extra month and the numbers are just moving in one direction, one party's direction. Yeah, if you're a Republican, now granted, this is California, Ben, and Republicans really are kind of the downcast, trodden minority out here. You just feel like the fix is in.
Yeah, it is. That delay is really harmful to public confidence in the election process as a whole. And that's a real downside. And the way you get out of it is to change the laws that allow for those long delays to take place.
Mm-hmm.
You can open up if you want to, if you're worried about depriving people of opportunities, you can extend the voting period before the election to provide the same number of dates. But a deadline is a deadline, and many states do call for absentee ballots to be in on election day.
Well, but here again, Ben, we're treating voters like children because California mails a ballot to me a month before the election. Do I need the ballot 2 months before the election? Now we're getting to a separate problem. Let's say I get my ballot in the mail 2 months beforehand and I decide to vote that way. What if something incredibly awful comes out about the guy I'll vote for? It turns out that he was a mastermind behind the guy who got shot in New York City or something like that. I can't take back my vote, can I?
No, you can't. Which is, although some states do have provisions where you can go in and have your ballot pulled out.
Yeah. But I just think,
but not in California.
Yeah, look, you're giving voters 30 days to make up their minds about something.
You can do that, folks.
Yeah. I spent some time on the National Association of Secretary of State's website, Ben, and looked into what various other states do. And first of all, you see the problem that California has. California has about 22 million voters, usually at a presidential election, because we're just a huge state. And about 90% of those votes, Ben, are by mail. So this is the pig and the python. You can't digest that many votes if you're looking at each one and trying to make sure the signatures match. I looked up numbers for New York State in 2020. In 2020, Ben, California actually had 15.4 million mail ballots. In that same cycle, Ben, New York had 1.7 million absentee mail ballots as well. So, this is the California problem, just how dynamic it is. But then I looked at Florida, Ben, and Florida does something that I think California and other states have to consider. The deadline for returning a mail ballot in Florida, Ben, is when?
I believe it's election day.
Correct. You know your elections. It's election day in Florida. We don't give, like in California, an extra week to send it in. It shows up 7 days later in California, still voted. You got to turn in an election day. So this gets back to the Ginsberg theory, treat voters like adults.
Yep. And I believe that there are only 12 states that allow ballots to come in after election day. And it was also, Pennsylvania was very slow in counting its ballots this year, is that Pennsylvania's Senate recount highlighted. But generally, the count is slow in Pennsylvania, in part because the Pennsylvania legislature doesn't allow for the pre-processing of absentee ballots. So the count becomes very late. Arizona was very slow because it allows voters to bring in absentee ballots on election day, and that always creates a huge backup.
So, Ben, how would California choose your favorite saying here, the horse back in the barn, the genie in the bottle, if you will? How does California kind of undo what it's done? Because as you mentioned, back during COVID, California, like other states, decided to go to mail-in ballots. It was a genuine health concern then, but California has since made that the permanent law. So every election, every registered voter in California gets a ballot. They're not going to undo that.
No, you're not going to unpeel mail balloting, right? People like it, people take advantage of it. But you can have the deadline for receipt of the ballot on election day. That's a matter of changing a law.
Yeah.
The notice and cure provisions in California extend that even further. There are certainly states that have notice and cure provisions, which means if your signature doesn't match or there's a date that's missing, election officials will call you up and tell you to come in and change your ballot. You can reduce the time period for that. All in all, there are a number of practical changes that can be made to speed up the process.
No, I have some friends, Ben, who will tell you that money will solve all the problems. That if you simply spend more money hiring more county election officials, that they can count faster, that if you spend more money on outreach, people will vote earlier. Have you seen any studies or any empirical evidence which would suggest that a public service announcement will encourage people to turn in their ballots a week before the election?
Well, I think a public service announcement right before an election might be able to convince people to do that.
Yeah.
The notion of hiring more people is not the issue, however.
Ben, I don't know if you saw if there's a piece of The Atlantic that ran the other day. It's called the $100 million election flop. And what it focused on was a effort by election reformers to go to a handful of states across America. And I found this really fascinating thing to read. They wanted to change how elections are done in Colorado and Oregon. These are two pretty blue operations here. Nevada and Arizona, which were two of the 7 swing states in this election, plus Montana, Idaho, and South Dakota, which are pretty decidedly Republican in national elections. And what they wanted to do, Ben, was they wanted to bring in the Alaska approach to voting, which is the so-called Final Four voting. And for our listeners and viewers who are not familiar with this, Alaska has a rather unique voting system. They hold an open primary, meaning everybody from every persuasion is on the same ballot, and the top 4 finishers then advance toward November, not 2, but 4, and then voters decide the winner by ranked choice voting. And what was interesting here, Ben, was they tried this in blue states, they tried this in red states, and states somewhere in between, and the idea bombed.
Yeah, it certainly did. It did succeed here in the People's Republic of the District of Columbia.
Oh, gosh.
which the Atlantic article did not report. And Alaska held on just by a whisker
Like 700
keep
votes.
that
Yeah.
system. Nevada was in a position where it passed 2 years ago, but had to pass a second time, and that failed. What's interesting about this is that ranked choice voting is a project that is being very much pushed by a group of elitists. And I think you can explain the sort of bipartisan rejection of this as an effort by the elites to change the laws under which they're not capable of winning elections. So instead of going out and doing the hard grassroots work of getting people to vote for your candidate, they're proposing a rules change to make it easier for their folks.
Okay.
So not surprising that it gets rejected.
It sounds like you're not a fan of the system.
I'm not a fan of the system. I think ranked choice voting is far too complicated. It is capable of being gamed by wily political operatives. So I think that it is sort of a short-term solution at best. And I think it is sufficiently complicated that it favors the elites. I mean, the Cambridge, Massachusetts City Council has had ranked choice voting about as long as any jurisdiction. And more and more, it is sort of well-educated folks who understand how to maneuver ranked choice voting to vote for all the candidates who end up being the most successful in electoral government. I think the top 2 system or top 4 system is in a sense more interesting. But on all the sort of reforms that also include things like proportional representation and a number of other cures to the system that are favored in certain academic institutions. I mean, all of them are really attempts to change the rules in a partisan fashion in a manner that really is a substitute for proponents of those reforms not being able to win elections, not
Yeah.
having their ideas universally embraced.
To clarify, when you say top two system, you're referring to, say, California, which
Right.
has primary, and the primary is everybody goes on the same ballot, and the top two finishers, regardless of party affiliation, advance toward November.
Yes.
Yeah.
The theory is that this produces more moderate victors and forces people to the center to be able to vote the majority, to be able to get the majority of voters as opposed to people on the polls.
Right.
I don't know. How's that going in California, Bill?
Well, let's don't let California hijack this because there are things I want to talk about, but let's spend a moment on it because it's created some very funny dynamics in this state. Let me take you back to 2018, for example, when Gavin Newsom open seat, Jerry Brown stepping down as governor, and so Democrats, Republicans are lining up to run. So Gavin Newsom, at the time lieutenant governor, he goes on to win the election. He lives in fear of having to face Antonio Villaraigosa, the former mayor of Los Angeles, in the general election. Why does he fear Villaraigosa? Ragosa has high name recognition in Southern California, Latino. He's a player in California, and Newsom doesn't want to face this guy. So what does Gavin Newsom do, Ben? He spends a ton of money advertising against whom? Running negative ads against whom? Not Antonio Villaraigosa, but the most prominent Republican in the race. Why? Because his people come to the conclusion that the more money we spend dumping on the Republican, it's going to raise his numbers among Republicans, and he is going to therefore finish second. And I'll finish first. If I can finish ahead of Villaraigosa and that weak Republican can finish second place overall, I then am going to become the governor. Why? Because in California, as I mentioned, it's about a 2-to-1 Democratic state in. So this is one example where the top two primaries maybe not worked out that well. And you're going to see this again in 2026, depending on what Kamala Harris does, if she runs for governor out here or not. It's very interesting, Ben. You get a lot of aspirational people lining up for an election. And here in California right now, the governor's race, for example, there are at least 6 people looking at running right now, maybe more. I've gotten since the election phone calls from 3 different people all asking me what I think about their running or not. It's just, when there's an open seat out here, because California governors tend to get reelected, it brings out everybody wants to run. But that's the problem, though. It's encouraged Newsom and other Democrats to really just try to raise the profile of the person they think is the weakest opponent come November.
Yeah, like I said, it's a reformer's cure that's going to be gained pretty quickly by the wily political operatives.
Yeah, but this takes a larger conversation for another day about the merits of that, the merits of term limits and so forth. But let me ask a question, my friend. What is your favorite political movie? Let me qualify that. What is your favorite movie that doesn't have you in it?
I've always been partial to that classic, The Candidate, the Robert.
That's what I was going to say. Thank you for reading my mind. It's not a setup, folks. I was going to say The Candidate. What is the last line of The Candidate?
Ooh, I'm going to leave that one for you.
Well, let me see if I can jog your memory. So the last line of The Candidate, let's spoil it for everybody, but you know what? The movie's been out for over 50 years. This is part of the beauty and the charm of the movie. It was filmed in 1972, released in 1972. A very young Robert Redford, who didn't play Ben Ginsberg later, but could have.
Pity.
Yeah, the parallels are eerie. Redford plays a very young aspirational Democrat named, I think, Bill McKay is his name. Mm-hmm. And he's running this is how old the movie is. He's running an uphill campaign as a Democrat in California. He's running against a very well-established Republican senator, and it's a very kind of cynical look at how politics are waged. Because he comes in as a young idealist, and he quickly realizes that in order to get elected, I got to ditch the idealism and just do what it takes to win. And so it's him just doing all kinds of various campaign stunts. But it's arguably been the best ending of any political movie. Why? Because it ends on election night when he, spoiler alert, has probably won. And you can appreciate this having been on campaigns. They show what's going on in his hotel suite. Everybody's running around. His wife's talking about where they're going to get a place in Georgetown and so forth. And what Redford, the candidate, does is he gets his guru, his Svengali, his campaign manager, pulls him aside, and they go to a quiet space. They sit down, and Redford looks up at him. These are the final words in the movie. He goes, "Now what do we do?"
It is
brilliant. And it's brilliant because it points out that this is sadly how a lot of elections are played in America right now. It's not what you're going to do. It's just about winning. So now what do we do? That is a very long-winded way, Ben, of me getting to this question. Now what do we do with election integrity, election reform in America? Now, there are scholars who are busy at this in addition to you. For example, there's a group called Scholars for Electoral Reform, who have actually written to Congress, and here's what they want. And I quote, electoral system changes such as proportional representation, expanding the size of the U.S. House, instant runoff voting, fusion voting, open primaries, and independent redistricting commissions.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Look, that's what I mean about elites who can't win elections want to change the rules to favor themselves. There are some of those reforms that are probably pretty good, but if you're going to change the rules of the game, it has to be bipartisan. And there
Yes.
is nothing, I think, bipartisan about that group.
Right.
So I think that the rules changes that are being talked about will not take place with a Republican Congress and a Republican president and Mitch McConnell chairing the Senate Rules Committee.
I thought about McConnell, but that was my next question. You want bipartisanship, but look, it's the Republicans' games, Republicans' rules. Granted, it's what is the Congress right now? It's what 220 to 215 in the House, but actually, it's soon going to be 217 to 215 when the members don't come back. So, good luck muscling stuff through. But you look at that Congress, Ben. What do you think they're going to do in the way of election reform, or does this tie back to what we talked about in the beginning, that everybody's kind of calm right now?
Well, I think there may be a Republican version of election reform. Remember when the Democrats controlled all three branches, they did the poorly named For the People Act. That was kind of a wish list of Democratic ideas that crashed because it had too many ideas in it, frankly, so that while it gained more supporters, it also gained more opponents and ultimately cratered.
I think also history showed that was kind of the beginning of the end of Kamala Harris, and that was kind of her first task as the vice president to shepherd that through Congress, and it just belly flopped.
Didn't go anywhere. Right. I think Republicans might try a election administration type bill with things like voter ID, mandates to clean up the rolls, amendments to the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act, which is pretty old and does need some help. There might be some cyber safeguards in some legislation. I mean, I do think that while the complaints about the conduct of the 24 election went underground, that the issue is still alive. But of course, the problem with any election bill in a new administration is that Donald Trump has a very robust policy agenda that with those margins is not going to be easy to get through. And so it's while I think there may be a bill drawn up by the House Administration Committee, Republicans on election reform, it's not going to be a high priority and unlikely to go anywhere. Of course, what happens in the states can be an entirely different matter, although the political makeup of, I think, only the Michigan legislature changed in all the legislative races. I do think that there is an opportunity, not in the legislative arena, but rather in sort of the policy area for Trump folks to explain the evidence that they have that elections are not reliable and to sit down and see if there aren't a series of things that can't be examined for the flaws that are perceived in the system, with either corrections for that or recognition that the system works pretty well, no matter who wins.
What about governors, Ben? Is it too kumbaya for me to think that maybe Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania could hook up with Ron DeSantis in Florida, and just a handful of red, blue, and battleground governors could get together and talk about common sense reform, or is this just not America in 2024?
Well, I think they can talk about it as leaders of a nationwide commission to offer ideas. The election laws and the system in Pennsylvania and Florida are pretty different. For example, Pennsylvania has a bottom-up system where each of the 67 counties has a huge amount of independent authority. Florida is a much more uniform state. They only have one type of machine. And while the counties in Florida do have a pretty large degree of independence. It's not as much as in Pennsylvania.
Right, well put. Okay, getting back to Congress. Let's say Congress moved forward on voter ID, Ben. I could see one or two ways to advance this argument. One is the common sense argument that Ben Ginsberg goes to buy a bottle of booze in the grocery store. They're going to ask for his ID, even though clearly you and I are a few years past
Or
age.
a library book, Bill. Let's use the library book.
Or a library book. Okay, would put you on a higher plane. Booze for me, library book for you.
Yeah.
Ben Ginsberg wants to rent a car. He needs to show an ID. Ben Ginsberg gets on an airplane. He's got to show ID. You need to show identification to do most anything in society, but not to vote. So that's the common side argument, Ben. But is there a fraud argument? In other words, could you, if you're presenting this case to Congress, could you point to fraud?
Well, I'm not sure that I can't point to instances of fraud.
Right.
What I can do is point to the public opinion polls that show that over 80% of the people favor voter ID because it gives them confidence that there aren't ineligible voters voting. So I think that the factor that it raises confidence in the institution of elections is really the strongest argument for voter ID.
Okay. All right, Ben, let's put you back out there in the 50 states. One election ends, another one begins. There are already people, as I mentioned, in California running for governor in 2026. This just never stops. Let's start looking at the system moving ahead. I mentioned Bill McCabe, Democratic, icon. Let's talk about another Democratic icon, Teddy Kennedy. What did he say at the 1980 convention in the swan song? The work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, the dream shall never die. And I cannot do a Kennedy imitation. Maybe you can, but let's talk about the dream shall never die, Ben. What work remains to be done on election integrity?
It's building back public confidence in election results. Again, this may be a magic time where both parties seem to agree that this election was done well. But I think we have to be honest that the system itself is not perfect. It is not built for precision. We have over 10,000 different jurisdictions. That means the counting and casting of ballots is going to vary as much as human nature does. There's not 10,000 of anything that will be secure. There's a perpetual problem with enough research and development in the voting technology area, simply because it's a product that's used a couple of times every other year and largely not much. There's a workforce problem. The system is really fueled by people even older than me who volunteer for elections. That problem has been exacerbated by threats to election officials, so that fewer people are volunteering. That's got to be corrected. There are a number of standards of reliability and laws that can be put in, again, to raise confidence that the system is working properly. So I think that you can do a number of reforms like that, including a better voter roll maintenance system. We're a very mobile society, so people move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There is a program that only about 30 states, maybe less than that now, are a part of, where they cross-check their voter registration rolls to stop dual voting. I think more robust participation in that would certainly help. The slow count that we were talking about before in California and some other states could be corrected. So there are some improvements that could be made to the election system, and the complaints that has come from Republican officials in the form of their lawsuits should be litigated. I mean, if there's evidence of real problems in the system, we ought to get that evidence out on the table and address how to fix it to increase confidence in the institution of American elections.
Right. Now, voter ID law, Ben, that would be federal and that would apply to 50 states. But are we talking about 50 state solutions as well in terms of election integrity? Or are we back to square one and hoping that the 50 states individually do the right thing?
You're back to it being a system where the states really control. I mean,
Right.
you could have federal ID for federal elections, but you could also see a state saying, well, you don't have to have photo ID for our state elections
Right.
because we think it cuts back on the vote. So the elections area is one where you do need bipartisan buy-in
Mhm.
to common sense reforms to improve the system uniformly.
Yeah, I think where I'd see frustration would be you look at a state like California, New York, Illinois, the really big states have big voting populations, especially California, Ben, where everybody's getting a ballot in the mail. California needs to be constantly purging its system and going through and changing it. I don't know how long you lived in your house, Ben, but I imagine when you moved in, there was a period for several years where you're still getting mail from the person who lived there before you. And
Yeah.
eventually it goes away. But you wonder in a state like California, just how long into the future you're going to be seeing, people in one house getting multiple ballots. And I'm not playing dark conspiracy card or anything like that, but just common sense dictates that you just need to be scrubbing that thing constantly because why? You're right. People come and go from addresses.
Yeah, on mail ballots, which you're right, is like the preeminent example of something that just feels wrong to people.
Yeah.
Those ballots don't get counted because there are checks when the ballots are received to make sure it's a valid voter. But
Right.
you're right, getting this ballot that could be voted is something that decreases confidence in the system. And
Right.
that's why it's worth changing, even if those votes are ultimately screened before they're counted.
But it jams the system, Betty. Let's say, okay, the good news is
Totally
the vote
jams
doesn't
the
get counted,
system.
but that means that poor Ben Ginsberg or Bill Whalen has still had to waste, 10 minutes of their life scrubbing the darn thing.
You are correct.
Okay. All right. Let's talk now about what you're doing at Hoover. What comes next for you?
I want to take a look at this way that we can air all the concerns about the accuracy of the system
Mm-hmm.
and be able to bring people from across the political spectrum together to take a look at what evidence may exist that there are real problems. Part and parcel of that is the common sense solutions we were just talking about and trying to get some bipartisan buy-in for that, maybe draft model legislation for the states. And I think on a longer term, we need to spend some time reimagining our election system to make it more accurate, more reliable, to give people a greater sense of confidence in it.
All right. Are you looking at other states, Ben, or are you looking at other countries?
Well, I think you got to start this at home
Mm-hmm.
and look at other states. I think it is helpful to have some comparativists tell you what's going on in other states, but
Right.
we have such a long, rich history of the way we vote that I think looking at other countries can be informative for solutions, but American exceptionalism is going to prevail here, and it's ideas that will come as opposed to usually do it the way they do it in X country.
Exactly. Is there any one state you turn to? I think on the last podcast, I talked up Florida because Florida just impresses me with just how fast they move. And it's a big state and it's a complicated state given time zone changes and weather, you name it, Florida. Trouble always seems to find Florida, but Florida does their elections really cleanly and quickly.
Really well. I would give a lot of kudos to Georgia
Hmm.
this time around. It did a really good job. I think North Carolina suffered from the hurricanes right before the election, and actually, although they have one painfully tight state Supreme Court race, the
Hmm.
system itself for counting ballots really held up well, including
Hmm.
in that tight race where all the counts seem to have been accurate. Michigan passed some new laws for this year that seems to have sped up their counting considerably. Um, and they all deserve a lot of credit for that.
Okay. And then what about Donald Trump and his followers? On election night, when the election was not settled, Donald Trump was out there saying that the fix was in Philadelphia and phony votes were being counted. I think he said the same about Detroit as well. Then suddenly the election went his way and he got very quiet. But I think there's still that strain out there that elections are still rigged and it's us versus them.
Yeah, that's what I mean about gathering the evidence that would have been presented in the 100 or so lawsuits and really examining the evidence that would have been behind those complaints to see if there is a problem or it can be corrected. So whether you agree with Donald Trump on his charges about elections, which I don't believe they're accurate. But even if you do, now is the time to surface all that evidence and really try and address any problems.
Yeah, well put. Well, Ben, I think we should wrap this up. I think, there's a lot to be thankful in this holiday season. I think you and I should be very thankful for the fact that we're doing a podcast which contains relatively good news as opposed to you and I. When we first were scheduling this out, we thought we'd be sitting here in the middle of December going through hell scenarios with the constitutional crises, an electoral count vote being challenged, and states fighting each other over the outcome. We had a pretty grim view of what might happen, and you know what? It didn't pan out, did it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make dinner reservations for January 6th now, Bill.
Sounds good. Yeah, you behave yourself on January the 6th, Mr. Ginsberg, okay?
I will.
Okay, Ben, I enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed doing these podcasts with you, and just thank you very much for being part of the Hoover Institute. You do great work, and it's really an honor to have you on board.
Likewise, you do a great job with this podcast and all the other ones you're involved with, and Hoover is just a marvelous institution. I feel really fortunate to be affiliated with.
I'm going to remember that I need a lawyer when I'm in jail, Ben. You've been listening to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a Hoover Institution podcast exploring America's election system and the many challenges of the democratic process in these charged partisan times. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our show. And if you wouldn't mind, spread the word. Tell your friends about us. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our Hoover X handle is @HooverINST. That's HOOVERINST to be exact, @HooverInst. If you want to learn more about Ben Ginsberg, you'll find a very nice biography at Hoover's website. You go to hoover.org to find that. And while you're there, sign up for the Hoover Daily Report, which keeps you updated on what Ben and his Hoover colleagues are up to. That's delivered to your inbox weekdays. For the Hoover Institution, this is Bill Whalen, wishing you all the best for these holiday seasons. Thanks for listening.